In question 1 we're given the following diagram here, which we're told is a section through the heart and its associated blood vessels. We're then asked which sequence of numbers from these labelled figures here shows the course of blood flow from the point of entry to the heart from the lungs to its eventual exit from the heart to supply the lungs. So this is a specific course of the blood flow that we need to think about, rather than just the conventional one that we like to think about of the vena cava to ultimately leading to the aorta. This is a slightly more complicated one which will involve some understanding of the structures involved. So we need to identify the structures within here, which you may not be especially familiar with sections of the heart and the blood vessels, so it's a good thing to just quickly remind yourself of a schematic of blood flow. So it looks a bit like this, where we have our vena cava draining into our right side of the heart and our pulmonary vein returning oxygenated blood to the left side of the heart, having pumped from the pulmonary artery from the right ventricle, and then that blood ultimately leaves from the aorta to supply the rest of the body. But this is a specific sequence that we're talking about here. We're talking about blood flow from the lungs to ultimately supply the lungs, so i.e. blood from the pulmonary vein to the pulmonary artery. Okay, so we already should be able to think about that course of blood flow, but we need to anchor this in these labels here. So we need to assign these labels to the structures that we have listed here. Well, how would we go about doing that? Well, this is a section through the heart, so this would presumably be the left-hand side of the heart on the right side, since obviously if we were viewing a person from the front, this would be the left-hand side, it would be sort of the mirror image. And likewise, in our diagram, we've drawn the left-hand side of the heart corresponding to that. So 3 and 4 would presumably be 3 and 4 on our diagram here as the left atrium and the left ventricle. Similarly, we can do the same for the right-hand side of the heart, where 6 and 5 reflect the right atrium and the right ventricles. At this point, we should be able to identify the associated blood vessels based on what we know. So obviously the vena cava will be 7, draining into the right atrium, and we have the pulmonary artery leaving the right ventricle, seen here. Again, we can identify that the aorta must be draining from the right ventricle, so that's from the left ventricle rather, so that's section 1. And finally we have 2 referring to the pulmonary vein returning oxygenated blood into the left hand side of the heart. So we've labelled all of this, and now we need to think about the course of blood flow. So it's blood flow from the lungs, which is the pulmonary vein, which is 2, to its eventual exit to supply the lungs. So we need to chart the course from 2 to 8, and at that point you should already be able to see that your answer will be option B, since that reflects the course from option 2 to option 8. But it's always good to get a sense of the total sequence, just in case you happen to have labelled any of them wrong. So we'll start with the entire course of the blood flow, which will be from 2 to 3, from the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, from which it will be pumped into the left ventricle, which is to 4, out through the aorta to the entire body, until it returns from the vena cava, seen here, into the right atrium, and then into the right ventricle, and then into the pulmonary artery, in order to supply the lungs with deoxygenated blood, and then that will return as oxygenated blood to the left-hand side of the heart. So this is our total sequence, which we can see identically corresponds to option B.